All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? So thank you for joining us today. I'm Cliff Lynch. I'm the director of the Coalition for Networked Information, and I'll be introducing this session. You have reached the first of the project briefing sessions for week 4 of the CNI Fall 2020 member meeting, which is taking place virtually. Just to remind you, week 4 is a collection of project briefings that deal with responses to various aspects of the collection of crises that we're trying to collectively navigate our way through. You're going to find quite an interesting set of narratives and experiences shared in week 4. I want to remind you that along with the synchronous sessions that we'll be having this week, we also have released a small number of additional pre-recorded videos that I invite you to explore. As to the logistics for this session, we are recording this and it will subsequently be publicly available. There is closed captioning, and please do turn that on if it's helpful to you. There is chat, and feel free to use that as we go along. There is also a Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. After the presentation, we will address as many of the questions as we can, and that will be done in a session moderated by Diane Goldenberg-Hart of CNI. So with that, let me turn to the current session. We have with us today Michael Shensky from the libraries of the University of Texas at Austin. And he is going to speak to an aspect of what really has kind of emerged as a theme from this meeting, which is all of the spaces that we have in our libraries and more broadly in our institutions that were designed and staffed and programmed for physical presence, and how we extend those services, adapt those services to the digital environment, things like computer labs, maker spaces. There's a great range of these kinds of situations. Today, we're going to hear specifically about GIS services, and we're going to hear, I think, not just about the response, but also about what the experience with the response has taught UT Austin about how they should be thinking about the future as we eventually come out of this pandemic. So with that, I would just like to thank Michael for joining us and turn it over to him.
All right, thank you for that excellent introduction. I am Michael Shensky, the GIS and Geospatial Data Coordinator for the UT Libraries at the University of Texas at Austin. And I will indeed be talking to you all today about how we have adapted our library's GIS services in the past 9 months or so, since we had to modify our operations starting in March of this year in response to the pandemic. And I'll be discussing some of the challenges that we've encountered, some of the changes that we've made, and discuss how we are starting to plan for the future, looking at spring of 2021 and beyond. So first, I'd like to give a brief introduction to our core UT Libraries GIS services to give everyone an idea of what we had going before the pandemic. Our core focus of what we were providing services to the campus community, because these are things that in many ways had to change and be adapted to this new environment that we found ourselves in starting in March. And so unfortunately, we don't have enough time today to touch on every aspect of our GIS services. And so I really wanted to focus on the services that are more core to our mission. And those are developing geospatial research guides using our LibGuides platform that we can use to provide instructional materials to help researchers, students, faculty, staff on campus who are dealing with common geospatial research issues or questions, installing GIS software, finding geospatial data to use in research projects, those kinds of things. We also have a Texas GeoData portal. This is something that we released a little over a year ago in November of 2019. And this is the platform that we're using to make geospatial data from our library's collections available to both the campus community and beyond. It's publicly available. We're openly sharing currently all of the data sets that the UT libraries are making available through the platform, which is about 700 or so. And we're also, through this platform, providing access to thousands of other open data sets from other institutions that openly share their metadata, which makes that possible. We also offer research consultations. So this is a core service that I provide in my position. Basically meeting with any folks on campus, again, whether they're students, faculty, or staff who have questions about how to move forward with geospatial aspects of their research. So whether they're dealing with a software issue, encountering an error message, or trying to figure out what software to select, or they're trying to find data that's a bit difficult, or they're trying to develop a plan for disseminating the results of their work through an interactive web map or maps that they're going to publish. Those are the kinds of things that I'll usually be helping with in research consultations, which have traditionally taken place via in-person one-on-one meetings on campus in the library itself. And we also lead GIS workshops and other types of geospatial focused events. So in that picture, you see me with slightly shorter hair from last year at GIS Day, where we were leading an event giving an introduction to GIS and our new GeoData portal. And we also regularly lead workshops, usually at least a few each semester, focused on GIS or related technologies that are designed to help skill up our campus community and provide these opportunities to learn about GIS and other geospatial techniques outside of a full semester academic course. And so prior to March 2020, all of these services were either offered or developed on campus. I really, prior to March, didn't have any experience working from home in this position. And so it was a big change to go from not working at home at all, working exclusively on campus, to then working exclusively at home. And as the GIS and geospatial data coordinator for the UT libraries, I am the main GIS person for the libraries. And so, figuring out how to adapt our services to meet the needs of the campus community in this new environment, that largely fell on me to put these pieces together and figure out how we might be able to make sure we're continuing to provide the support that the campus needed. In terms of the impact of the pandemic on our normal library operations, the campus had to make some significant changes to make things safe for everyone. Starting on March 16th of this year, we shifted to basically a mostly remote learning environment, and that has continued to the present with some classes going on campus, but much more limited than what we would normally see. The libraries have also adapted their operations. So most of our branch libraries have closed and remain closed. Our main library, the Perry Castaneda Library, which we see pictured in the top right of this slide, it has an occupancy cap that we can see there in the center of this slide. Screenshot taken from yesterday where we had 86 folks in the building out of a max of 400 that we can support. Our library hours have been reduced slightly from what they are in a normal semester. And the unit I'm in, scholarly communications within our libraries, our staff are working almost exclusively from home. And as I mentioned, I personally haven't been to campus since early March of this year and have been working from home since then. So a lot of changes, both for us in the libraries where we've had to figure out how to do our jobs and develop our services in a way that they can be offered remotely, and also adaptation for our members of the campus community who have needed to find new ways to access these services. And so it's been a negotiation where kind of adaptation all around, and we're really trying to meet the new needs of the campus community as best we can. And so starting here with a focus on our research consultations and how this has changed since the start of the pandemic. As I briefly mentioned before, pre-COVID, almost all of our consultations were in person. We see a picture there in the top right of our consultation room in our Perry Castaneda Library, where many of these consultation meetings would take place, where we have a whiteboard, we have a screen where folks can connect their laptops and display their screen up on that larger display there. We have multiple chairs where we can fit 5, 6, 7 people in the room if necessary. Usually most of our meetings are one-on-one, or me meeting with maybe 2 other folks for a consultation to discuss a research project. But since March, all of these research consultations have been conducted via Zoom. Zoom was something that the libraries actually got started with also in March. Fortuitously, the timing of that allowed us to shift very quickly to this all virtual format. And there have been some advantages to this, surprisingly. And that's one of the things that I kind of want to highlight with this presentation is that usually when things are upended and disrupted, right, there are these challenges we face, and sometimes that means we can't do things quite as well as we used to before we encountered those challenges. But one of the overall lessons I think that I've learned in this position over the last 9 months or so is that sometimes being forced out of that regular routine leads to innovations and discovery that sometimes doing things a bit differently can result in positive benefits for everyone. So some of these benefits that I've noticed from the shift to all virtual research consultations include greater flexibility for early or late consultations. I've had consultations as early as 7 in the morning and as late as 9 o'clock at night in cases where I'm in a meeting that is bringing in research collaborators from other time zones. So I've helped folks at UT in our research community who are collaborating with others in the UK and Australia. And they wanted, in some cases, those collaborators to join our research consultation. And in this virtual environment, that's possible much more easily than it would be if we were having to meet on campus in the way that we used to, let's say last year. And as I mentioned here, it also allows out-of-area collaborators to attend. So we don't have to be on campus to get these researchers together. We can all meet virtually, and everybody is so used to working with Zoom or similar platforms that I think is easier to do than it would have been a year ago if we tried to have an all virtual meeting where not as many universities subscribe to these types of services and folks weren't as quite as used to using them. We also developed a more efficient scheduling process via our main UT GIS services LibGuide, which we see pictured there in the bottom right. So there's now a scheduling button. So this was technically possible before the pandemic. The pandemic definitely provided an impetus to get some things done that were on the to-do list, but slightly lower priority. And so there was also this drive to find new ways of increasing the efficiency of our operations and making it easier for folks in this new environment to access our services. And so this was one of the things that we were able to get done really quickly after the start of this shift to remote learning. And it's expected these virtual consultations will continue in the spring of 2020, and it remains to be seen what patrons will prefer after that once we're able to return to normal operations. Will folks want to meet in person, or will there actually be a preference for virtual meetings because everyone's so used to that via Zoom, and because folks don't have to run across campus to meet in the library? They can be at home, I can be in my office, or I can be at home if I'm working from home, and we can all still meet and provide those consultation services. So there are some limitations here, where things are in some cases maybe a little bit more difficult, helping with coding challenges or software installation compared to if we were there in person. But in many cases, it's perhaps slightly better than it was pre-pandemic because of these changes we've been able to make. And interestingly, the number of consultations has actually increased year over year. Many of the questions that we've received since the start of the pandemic are actually very similar to those that we received pre-COVID. Again, how do I access or find a certain data set online? How should I develop a script to automate this process that I've developed for carrying out my analysis? How do I make this reproducible? Those questions continue to come up just as they did pre-COVID. And interestingly, software installation and access questions are not as frequent as initially feared at the start of remote learning. We thought that might be a challenge that folks would face if they're not able to come to campus like they used to access GIS software and other similar GIS geospatial software. But UT Libraries has started providing geospatial software access through virtual machines where we're using Apache Guacamole to provide access in that manner. And we have detailed GIS software installation instructions through our LibGuides. That's something we've had for years. I think many folks are used to using those to learn how to install the software. And so these types of questions really haven't come up all that frequently, which was nice to see. One of the other things that happened this year in terms of event planning was a shift from how we have approached GIS Day previously, and started to collaborate more with outside organizations and institutions that are also involved in the planning of GIS Day events. So 2020 marks the second year that UT has organized GIS Day events. Our first large-scale GIS Day celebration on campus was last year, which the UT Libraries participated in along with our Technology Resources Department. And we developed a whole series of in-person events in November of 2019. It was a great experience. We planned to do the same thing in 2020. And of course, that plan kind of went out the window in March when everything had to shift to virtual. And so in the spring, we started to plan for a virtual GIS Day. We realized that because everything was virtual, that this would open up the possibility of collaborating with other institutions outside of our local area who are also going to be forced to do everything virtually this year. And what ended up coming out of this was our participation in Texas GIS Day. So this is really, it was a series of 3 days of events that took place just this last month, a few weeks ago in the middle of November. And we collaborated with Texas A&M, University of North Texas, the ATX GIS Day Planning Group, Houston Area GIS Day Planning Group, really these folks from many different institutions and organizations who are already going to be planning their own virtual events. We all came together to utilize this shared platform that Texas A&M had developed to allow us to collectively promote our events through this one website, this one platform. And this ended up being really effective. It's unlikely, I think, that this would have happened in quite the same way if 2020 was a normal year and everybody was doing in-person events locally on their own campus or in their own venue. Because everything was virtual, we were able to come together and promote our events and collaborate in this way. And it was a really positive experience. We're already starting to discuss how we can continue to collaborate on a Texas GIS Day in 2021. So these discussions are just starting up now as we look forward to next year. Continuing with this theme of collaboration, that our changing operations this year have really facilitated in some ways. Again, this is somewhat of a positive thing that has come out of our changes that we've had to go through in response to the pandemic. I'll mention that pre-COVID, there were some attempts that we had made at the UT Libraries to try and build community with some of our other peer institutions across the state of Texas. To build community, build connections. I know I visited Texas State soon after I started in my current position in 2018 to get to know folks outside of just the UT community, but also learn what other universities in the local area were doing. And we also scheduled conference events. We had a session that we branded as a GIS Birds of a Feather session at our Texas Digital Libraries Conference in 2019. And we had a few folks coming from other institutions who attended. It was an early morning session. It was a nice opportunity to talk about what we were doing with GIS, what other institutions were doing with GIS, but it didn't really get a critical mass. There wasn't a lot of momentum that came out of that. And so in this year, we were planning to do another similar session in person in May of 2020. That conference was canceled because of the pandemic. And so we ended up kind of shifting gears and doing a virtual Birds of a Feather session, inviting folks from all of these other institutions across the state who are members of the Texas Digital Libraries to join us for a virtual Zoom event to discuss GIS services. And there was great interest. I think we had over 40 attendees on that call, a far greater number than we saw in person the previous year. And as a result, we were really able to build some momentum. We formed a GIS interest group in July that was organized by Texas Digital Libraries and supported by the Texas Digital Libraries that many of our Texas universities are members of. And within the span of just 6 months, we have developed a group charter. We've organized 2 webinars providing introductions to GIS and GIS services that libraries can provide. We have 4 standing subcommittees working on things like event planning, data collaboration, developing a survey to gather information about what institutions across the state are doing with GIS, and a mentoring subcommittee as well. We have over 20 members who are regularly attending events, and they're coming from over 8 institutions across the state of Texas. So overall, this has been a big success. I'm not quite sure that this would have come together in quite the same way if it had, again, been a normal year. I think this is something that really came about partly through this shift to these virtual types of events and everybody getting used to working and collaborating virtually. And we now have monthly meetings. We're already scheduling multiple events out into 2021. We're developing a survey to distribute to universities across the state of Texas to learn more about what they're doing with GIS services. And we're already starting to plan for ways that we can collaborate more around sharing data. One of the other things that was upended in March when we had to shift our campus operations was planning for a new scholars lab that we were envisioning going into our main library, the Perry Castaneda Library. This lab space can actually be seen in the lower left there. That's what it looks like currently. Well, pre-pandemic, probably not quite as busy today. But an implementation group was formed in early March 2020 after funding for design and construction were approved. So the idea was for us to be able to revitalize that space seen in the current bottom left of this slide, to put in a new data lab, to provide a new environment to build on actually some of the themes that we saw emerge from the fall CNI presentations earlier this semester about library spaces that can help facilitate the building of community on campus, help promote library services like GIS services. And we really wanted to leverage this opportunity to revitalize this space that's at the entry level for our main library to help promote many of our services, including GIS services, and develop new programming for the space. So it was really envisioned as a space that we could use to take our GIS services to the next level. Funding, unfortunately, was put on indefinite hold as of May 2020 due to COVID budget impacts, something that wasn't a big surprise once we saw how dramatically everything was being affected by the pandemic. But our interest in pursuing a revitalization of this space is undiminished. So we're hopeful that at some point in the not too distant future, these funds will become available again, or will be unfrozen, and we'll be able to continue to move forward with planning and eventually construction for this space. One of the things that the pandemic has given us an opportunity, though, to reflect more on is what a post-COVID lab space should look like, and what geospatial services should be offered. So how has the pandemic changed the interests, perceptions, needs of the campus community? And this gives us a chance to, while funding is paused, to reflect on those things and maybe design the space in a slightly different way than we would if we had embarked on this effort 2 years ago, pre-pandemic, right? I think we will be moving into a different world where folks have slightly different needs than they would have before the pandemic. So hopefully we'll be able to move forward with that soon. One of the other things I also want to make sure to mention during this presentation today is how we have adapted our geospatial research workshops to this new environment. So pre-COVID, all of our workshops were in person. And so we have a regular semester workshop series that we have branded the Data and Donuts workshop series. Usually when folks attend in person, they're able to grab a donut that we provide and sit down for an hour and a half to learn about a new technology or a new research technique. And our traditional schedules for the fall workshops to be general research data management type workshops. And for the spring workshops to be focused on GIS and geospatial research in particular. So with COVID, all of this was somewhat upended. Our spring 2020 workshops somewhat fortuitously happened to end really the week before everything locked down. So those took place as normally scheduled in person. Our fall 2020 workshops had to be conducted very differently. They were all virtual via Zoom. We used the Zoom webinar format to provide these workshops, the same format that we're using right now in Zoom. And workshops were designed to highlight things that were going on campus, like UT COVID research, to highlight other services that we wanted to make sure folks were aware of, like our Texas Data Repository. We had 4 workshops that were scheduled from 12 to 1 on alternating Fridays. So this is a slightly different schedule than we would usually have for our in-person workshops. We shifted the time earlier on Fridays. We didn't do back-to-back weeks. We wanted to give ourselves more flexibility to assess how things were going in this new virtual format. And the webinar licensing on our campus was a little bit complicated to work out, but the webinar format ended up being great. It worked really well. What we noticed from this is that attendance actually was much higher than usual. In a normal semester, maybe we see 30 to 40 attendees per event. This semester, we were seeing 70 to 50 attendees at each of our workshops. And so really the shift to virtual, again, ended up being in some ways slightly positive for us, where we were able to reach a larger audience than we could before. And we were really interested in learning more about why that was the case. We distributed a survey after the series wrapped up this semester. We were able to gain some interesting information that I'll mention here more in a second. And our workshops for 2020 will continue to be virtual. Again, based on the success we've had, clearly there is interest in these types of virtual events. We're actually going to be increasing the duration from 1 hour workshops to 1.5 hour workshops based on some of the feedback that we've received. And it'll be interesting to see what happens post-COVID once things are able to return to normal. In-person events become a possibility again. What does the campus community want to see? Do they want to see a mix of in-person virtual events? Do they have a strong preference for one format over the other? So that's something that we'll have to figure out as we move forward into the future, and hopefully the pandemic recedes, or we're able to, at some point in the not too distant future, resume normal operations. I also want to briefly mention, I know I'm running a little short on time here, the Texas GeoData portal. Suffice to say that basically things have been able to continue with our portal really in much the same way as they would have if the pandemic hadn't ever happened and we hadn't had to change our operations. Use of the portal has continued to increase, as we see in the lower left there. We've continued to add new data sets to the portal to build out our offerings, adding new data sets from our UT Libraries collection. So development and use has continued to grow even during the pandemic, which is great. And one of the final things I want to wrap up on here is how we've been able to leverage these changes that we've made in the last several months to carry out additional assessment and collect new data that can be used for assessment purposes. And I personally felt that this there was more urgency around this once we moved into this new work from home environment, where we're not there in person. There isn't this same level of everybody's seen what we're doing and seeing the things we're working on, and so being able to document that with data seemed particularly important. And so one of the things that I've done as time has permitted was developing some new scripted methods of gathering data and analyzing data that is just being generated through these virtual events that we're doing and other things that we're doing now in this new type of working environment. So writing scripts to track how many reference emails I'm sending, consultation tracking via analysis of Zoom statistics. So how often am I scheduling consultations? How many people are attending? How long do those sessions last? How many data sets are we contributing to the GeoData portal? How is the use of the GeoData portal increasing? And for our Data and Donuts workshop series, because folks were signing up for that through a registration page, we're able to gather new data there that wasn't possible before when those workshops were just drop-in. There was no pre-registration. And we're able to see, get a better idea of our audience. So is it mostly faculty, students, staff, who's attending? What is the average rate of attrition from registrations to actual attendance? And through our survey, we're able to glean what folks are interested in seeing in future semesters. And I know I'm out of time here, so I'll wrap things up and open it up for questions. I've also included a few links here that point to some of the resources that I've mentioned in the talk. And I've also included my contact information if anybody would like to reach out and ask after our presentation about any questions they might have. Thank you.
Oh, thanks a lot, Michael. That was really interesting. Loved hearing about your new partnerships and new opportunities that you all have experienced as a result of the pivot that took place in the spring. As you mentioned, we are at time, but I want to be able to get in at least this one question that we have, which comes to us from Joan Lippincott, who asks, do you have any initial thoughts on how your thinking has changed about your plans for your digital scholarship physical space?
So we did receive results from, I believe, 8 faculty members who are teaching geospatial or GIS courses on campus. And we were able to use that information to get some better insight into what was of greatest importance to faculty that are involved in that type of work on campus. And there is interested in a virtual lab environment, right, where we can provide access to software outside of the lab space. But there's still strong interest in seeing, high-end computers that can handle, the type of intensive geospatial computation that's required for many of the research projects being carried out on campus. We were able to get a better idea of what folks are looking for in terms of the hardware that they want to see in the lab. What is of most importance, right? If we have a fixed budget, how should that be spent on computer resources? Again, if we're focusing on supporting the needs of geospatial researchers, which are just one segment of our overall community that we're supporting. And consultation spaces, co-working spaces, those were things that we've also had discussions about that I think maybe need to be designed a bit differently than they would have pre-COVID. How many seats do we try to put into a lab? How close do people want to be when they're working together? And how can we maybe facilitate in-person events that are also maybe able to be streamed virtually, right? So there does seem to be this strong interest in virtual events that folks can attend, even if they're not able to be on campus at a particular time. These are all things that I think we're going to need to discuss further as we resume the planning process. And again, once that funding is freed up again, that I think those will be some of the conversations that we have, and start to think through how we can still use this new space to really promote our services and provide the things that the campus is going to need moving forward in this new environment, this new era that we go into post-COVID.
To be sure. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Joan, for the question, and Michael, thank you for answering that. And seeing as we are a little bit past time here, I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording and just bring the public portion of this to a close. Thanking our presenter, Michael. Thank you so much for joining us at CNI and all of our attendees. But Michael's going to hang around a little bit and chat with us. I know I have more questions. I imagine some of you do as well. So if you have the time and would like to stick around and join the conversation, just after I turn off the recording, raise your hand. I'll be happy to turn on your microphone. Thanks so much, everyone. We hope to see you back at CNI. Bye-bye.